Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha.
It's a tremendous imbalance in power.
A lot of the times it would take more than 30 days.
Buildings change hands real fast.
They will sell the property almost annually in a lot of these cases.
Literally, the tenants don't know who the owner or property manager is.
The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated all manner of challenges people already faced around housing. Here in Missouri, a federally funded state assistance for housing relief program was meant to provide rental and utility aid directly to landlords on behalf of tenants hit financially by the pandemic. An in-depth report commissioned by the River City Journalism Fund examines that program, specifically how some of the same landlords who benefited from government assistance are evicting people from their homes. Here with me now to talk about it is the investigation's author, Riverfront Times writer Mike Fitzgerald. Mike, it's good to have you back on the show.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
Also joining us today is Kennard Williams, organizing manager with the group Action St. Louis. Kennard, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on here today.
And thank you both for joining us. So, eviction filings. These are concentrated in a few hotspots, according to Eviction Lab data. Mike, what is the state of evictions in the St. Louis region? And are they better or worse than they were during the pandemic?
Well, as the Eviction Lab shows and as court filings indicate, there has been a dramatic increase in a lot of areas, these hotspots. And part of the problem is that this COVID relief program to help tenants and landlords provided no means for a soft landing. There are no strings attached to this funding. Now, this program, which is called SAFER, it prevented at least 86,000 evictions, but the problem was there was no anticipation of the impact when the funding ran out. Also, even though there was a lot of warning that inflation would send rent prices soaring, there was no preparation for that.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the jobs that a lot of moderate income people work, the pay just did not keep pace, and so we have a lot of big problems, and that's been accentuated by the lack of affordable housing. And this is a problem that's being repeated not just in St. Louis but all across the country.
And when you say moderate income, how much are we talking about?
That's a lot of the. Oftentimes it's below market rate, but at some apartments it's like $550, $600 a month. But unfortunately for a lot of folks, that's close to half their monthly wages.
Right.
Yeah.
So your investigation, it focused on several apartment complexes, including Spanish Cove townhomes in Florissant, Parkview Gardens apartments in University City, and Fountains at Carondelet. When did you first realize that it was worth looking into how much the owners of these properties had received in those pandemic assistance funds?
Well, I've been hearing sporadically in the news and so forth that there was an eviction crisis all across the country, and I was really interested in that. And I just started going to housing court in St. Louis City and St. Louis County, just sitting back, watching the proceedings and talking to people facing eviction. And one of the things that kept coming up is that these folks were caught in this web. The payments they were getting through this COVID relief program called SAFER were confusing. They didn't know what they owed and so forth. And before they knew it, they were owing $5,000, $6,000 in back rent and facing eviction. Since they didn't have attorneys representing them, they were defenseless basically.
Right.
Because that's one of the things about the eviction process, is Kennard will attest, it's a tremendous imbalance in power. The landlords have attorneys who specialize in eviction, whereas in the vast majority of cases, the tenants don't. And so either they default and don't show up to court, or they have a judgment against them. And one of the big problems is once you get that scarlet E on your record, it haunts you for the rest of your life in many cases. You can't hide from it, and it keeps people from getting good housing in good neighborhoods and getting jobs and credit and so forth.
Kennard, what is it that tenants told you about their experience applying for state assistance for housing relief, that is.
Yeah, so with the SAFER program, when it was first initiated, there was a lot of hiccups with the implementation of the program, how it was set up. Initially, when the program was set up, tenants had to get permission, a sign-off from their landlord to even accept rental assistance. So a lot of the times what we were seeing in a lot of these situations were people who identified a need for the assistance, applied for the assistance. Perhaps their landlord wanted to raise the rent or get them out of there and decided to just not allow it to go through.
Okay.
So, there was a lot of issue with that. So, which kind of led to like a bit of a discriminatory issue for people being able to, apply and receive those funds. But also beyond that, there was a lot of lags and delays with the program, and considering Missouri's eviction laws and the way the courts were moving, a lot of the times it would take more than 30 days for those funds to reach people and get processed in time.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, it is the tenants who were applying, but landlords were the ones who were receiving the money?
Correct.
And what about that is notable or remarkable?
I mean, I think the fact that, there's all of this pressure to for the tenant to produce in order to do this, like, overcome all of these feats, suffice you get through the mountain of paperwork, you get through the ocean of time you got to wait, then it gets to the point where it either gets approved or not, and your whole livelihood is left in the balance of that. Mm-hmm. And, that still didn't help people as much as it needed to, because they needed to apply later on. A lot of situations changed, and people still ended up getting evicted, even though landlords got their money in the end.
Right. Mike?
It's important to remember this was a $600 million program. Missouri was one of the last states to get it off the ground. In fact, the U.S. Treasury Department had to kind of give them a kick in the pants to get it started.
Yeah.
One problem was Missouri lawmakers allocated a very small percentage for overhead. What did that translate to? Well, there was no help. There was no helpline. Mm-hmm. Or if there was a helpline, it was always overwhelmed.
Right.
And so like some of the individual attorneys I've talked to who represent tenants, they were basically the helpline.
Okay.
And so a lot of people, when they had questions about what to do or how to fill out the forms, they had nowhere to turn. And so, the thing about it is it's important to remember we may go through this again. There may be another pandemic or some other kind of national emergency. We got to get this right. We got to do it better.
As far as the tenants who applied for SAFER and then were able to stay in their homes, what are the numbers around that, Mike?
Well, at least 86,000 people, according to the agency that oversaw this program, the Missouri Housing Development Commission, 86,000 people kept the roof over their house. Mm-hmm. Had over 156,000 tenants received some type of financial assistance through this program. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there was success, but because the program began so late compared to similar programs nationwide, a lot of folks who probably qualified never got the money and never kept the roof over their head. Mm-hmm. And it's important to remember the only people who qualified for this financial assistance were people who could show that they suffered some type of hardship through the pandemic. Either they got sick or they lost their job or whatever. And so a lot of people were being evicted, like at Spanish Cove, hundreds of people were being evicted through 2022, even though other people were qualifying for SAFER funding. So it's a very imperfect program. And one of the things I think it's incumbent on state officials is to do a look back and say, okay, how can we get this better? Because we'll probably go through this again.
Mm-hmm. And when we say we, and we talk about tenants, the tenant, I guess what I think of most immediately is the person who is responsible for paying the rent. But these are homes that are occupied by more than just one person, right?
Yeah, I do want to be clear when we talk about that. When we talk about an eviction filing, we're talking about a family. It's not just one person. It's multiple people who live here. And, this has a real impact. When we talk about the impact of evictions on a family, in addition to it being harder for me to commute to where I need to go to from home to work and to get my kids to school, when we look at the impact of education on children who are in families that get evicted. Excuse me.
Oh, sure.
When we talk about the impact of eviction on families and children, we don't look at, the impact of our schools. We currently have issues with enrollment in our public school system, but 20% of our SLPS population is unhoused or are currently dealing with some sort of housing instability. So this is a very big issue that attacks just the core of people's daily, everyday lives for working class people in St. Louis.
Right. Now, your piece, your investigative piece, Mike, it opens with the story of Latice Valiant. And she is someone who lived at Spanish Cove townhomes with her young son. What did she tell you about the impact on her as the tenant, but also someone with a child?
Right. It was, well, as you would imagine, it was disastrous. I mean, because of that eviction on her record, it was very difficult to find housing somewhere else. She wound up at an apartment complex called Ridgeview in Riverview, Missouri, just north of the St. Louis city line. And it's a frightening place, really. When I interviewed her in August, I mean, there were squatters there, there was drug dealing, there was lots of trash and crime. But that was the only place she could find to live, according to her, because of that eviction filing. There's a great book out called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. He's a sociologist who points out just the physical and mental toll that eviction takes on people. You know, suicide rates spike among people who are evicted, mental health crises, physical decline, all because of eviction. I mean, if you want to understand why poverty and homelessness persist in a society as wealthy as America, you got to understand the eviction process, because it's an industry too. A lot of people make lots and lots of money from the eviction process. So they're very happy with the status quo. They're going to fight any changes to it, But there is good news. Like Kennard's group, they were very effective in helping pass the right to counsel law that the city of St. Louis passed this year. And that levels the playing field where people can have a right to an attorney.
Right. Can you talk about that a little?
Yes. So over the summer in July, the Board of Aldermen passed tenants' right to counsel, it's a phase-in program, but it would get lawyers for people who are facing eviction that currently don't have a lawyer. Normally if you get convicted of a crime, you would get a public defender to represent you if you can't afford one. There's no apparatus for that in housing court. So therefore, people who are facing eviction are often left on their own. And the current numbers are looking like overwhelmingly in favor of the landlords, because they most likely can't afford legal representation. They most likely have gone through this process multiple times. And a lot of the times the tenant has not. The tenant may be returning into this position, for whatever reason. And also a lot of the times when tenants get to this position, there's other things that could come up in court that paint a bigger picture of what the experience has been here. A lot of the times when we look at eviction, it's the image is cut and dry, like, oh, this person didn't pay the rent. But a lot of the times, particularly in these properties that we're talking about, in Fountains and Ridgeview and these places, this is very clear negligence on the part of these property owners and these property managers who use these places to exploit lower earning people and then grind them out and throw them out on the street. And, when we look at the bigger picture of this is a public safety issue. We have investors and people with this money coming in, buying up these properties, holding them in poor repair, exploiting poor people, and then kicking them out on the street. And on the other end, what do we have to do when people become unhoused?
Right.
So it's a very tied issue between people who are unhoused and people who are facing eviction. And it often ends up being split into a two different class issue. But if I miss my rent at the end of this month and, got evicted, I don't have a place to go.
Yeah.
I will be becoming unhoused. So I think it's very important to, look at the impact of, the power dynamics of landlords being in this position versus tenants who are really trying their best to make ends meet.
And I think it's important to remember that it's going to get worse before it gets better. St. Louis is seen as a prime opportunity for many out-of-state investors. The property here is inexpensive compared to the East or West Coast. Also, we have very weak tenant protections. We have the cheapest, I believe it's the cheapest cost for filing an eviction, only $33 on average in Missouri. That compares to Alabama, which is $272. The Eviction Lab has calculated that for every $100 you raise the cost of an eviction, you lower the number of evictions by 2%. So there's very simple tweaks that state lawmakers can do, like by raising the cost, so it's less likely for landlords to evict people because of the cost involved. Right now, it's very cheap to evict people.
We're going to take a very quick break, but when we come back, we will continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. Before the break, Mike, you were mentioning raising the cost to file an eviction, and that cost to file in Missouri is well below that of other areas. Kennard, what are other solutions that you see helping to alleviate the eviction crisis that's happening right now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different interventions that could happen here, quite a few policy ones as well. The We the Tenants campaign and a lot of other housing campaigns in St. Louis have been advocating for the passage of a tenant bill of rights. Currently, the slate of rights for tenants in the state of Missouri is very limited. That's on purpose. And, with more protections in line, many tenants would be protected from evictions, a lot of the harassment they endure, retaliation, et cetera. There's no real standard of, rules that a landlord has to follow. It's very bare and minimum. And a lot of them, especially if you're not a present landlord who's active or on the property, you don't know what's going on in your building. You probably don't care if you're not there and actively, checking in on people. So tenant bill of rights, a rental registry, so people have someone to get in contact with. A lot of the times we'll be canvassing and talking to people and they won't know who their landlord is, especially in a lot of these large complexes, because they will sell the property almost annually in a lot of these cases, get a new landlord, won't notify the tenants, and then tell them, hey, you owe a bunch of money to somebody who you don't even know has become your landlord in the process.
Right. Now, Mike, you are not a tenant at these properties, but you had a hard time getting in touch with people, right?
Well, the owners, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of times it was very difficult. They don't want to talk to you, or they will hide behind limited liability corporations, LLCs, and you don't even know the true identity of the owner.
Who are the owners, the ones that you know of, and where are they? You mentioned earlier.
Right. Well, I
people from
interviewed
out of state.
briefly the owner of a company called Area Legacy Management of Lakewood, New Jersey. He owns a number of large apartment complexes. It's a very secretive world. It's like there's, publicly traded property owners out there, but most of them are very secretive organizations. They don't want you to know who the real owners are, or the big problem, like as Kennard just mentioned, is these buildings change hands real fast, and literally the tenants don't know who the owner or property manager is.
Right.
And they're sending money and that's how they also get caught up in this web of eviction, because they're sending money to the wrong people month after month, and then the true owner comes and says, "You haven't paid up. You're going to be evicted." And it's a real mess sometimes. And there's a lot of things we can do. I think one of the biggest things, though, and it's going to take a lot of political will and public money, is building enough affordable housing. By the estimate of a group called Empower Missouri, there's at least 57,000 housing units this city needs for affordability, and we just don't have the political will to build them at this point.
Now, one of the things that you both mentioned is a group of people in the U.S. and in our region who are essentially stuck in low-tier housing, that market. And it's a tier that's characterized by disproportionately high rents and unsafe living conditions. Is there a fine line between this group of people, Kennard, and those who experience homelessness?
I think that, like I had mentioned earlier, it's often people who the narrative tries to split people who are put in this position. And, the reality is we're all a paycheck away from being unhoused, which is why it's very important that we take care of our unhoused population as well, in addition to our renters, but also try to find ways to house people and keep people in a place to live. As Mike mentioned, we do need more housing here. And, you can't have it both ways. You can't want to evict people, have stagnation of wages, and nowhere for people to live. We're continually throwing people out in the street. And if an eviction weighs so much on a person's record that I can't find another suitable place to live, I'm going to try to find somebody else who will rent to me.
Right.
And a lot of the time in this secondary market, you have these predatory landlords who absolutely do not care about the conditions or the safety or even the viability of the housing that people are living in. And they have no choice but A, pay the money, or B, not have a place to live. And that's a terrifying situation and reality for many families across the St. Louis area, particularly black families, particularly families that live north.
Yeah, I mean, some families, they will self-evict from a dangerous apartment complex. I mean, they don't want to be around drug dealing or shootings, so
Right.
they'll live in a car, because they figure it's safer.
Right.
So, I mean, this is also one thing about the eviction crisis is it's happening, for the most part, invisibly. I mean, for people living in Ladue or Kirkwood, Chesterfield, they're not seeing this, But it is a crisis, and it really is howling out big parts of our city.
Right. And what you've mentioned about voluntary eviction, that they're basically leaving homes before they can be evicted because having an eviction on their record means that they will not be able to find good housing in the future.
Can make it
right?
very difficult.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, we started the conversation talking about the State Assistance for Housing Relief program. And Matthew Chase is a University City-based lawyer who represented the fountains at Carondelet, and he had different criticisms of the pandemic-era funding program. He said there was a lack of vetting applications and that anyone could apply regardless of how affected by the pandemic they were.
Well, that's his interpretation. I mean, he's the region's busiest eviction lawyer, I think, hands down. He's got his take on things, I think he's qualified to give his observation, but when you talk to tenants, they come up with a different story. So that's what I tried to provide a perspective for both. I mean, I try to, I want to have as many people as possible put their voice in my story.
Now, is there any way to know exactly how many landlords and property owners utilized safer money, Mike?
The total number, I was never able to get the total number. I'm sure it's hundreds because we're talking mom and pop landlords, people who own just one or two units, and we're talking people who own huge complexes like Spanish Cove, which has nearly 800 units. They did give me a number of about 156,000 renters or people who hold mortgages and so forth. So it was a very big program. Like I said, it was $600 million. And, it was funded through the U.S. Treasury Department's Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And Congress authorized that in late 2020 to the tune of $46.5 billion. So it was huge.
Yeah. What are some of the lessons to be learned from how this particular program was handled, how it worked or didn't work so well, Kennard?
Yeah, I think that's a long list. I think one of the things is people need agency to be able to apply for these funds themselves and access it themselves as expediently as possible. As I mentioned, there were a lot of people who, were scrambling to get a hold of this money in the beginning, and it just never got to them, and those are hundreds of evictions that are currently sitting on people's records right now. People are very well struggling to find a suitable place to live, a safe place to live, and that impact is going to carry with them for years to come still.
Yeah.
And I think that we have a obligation to ensure that we protect as many people as we can from that outcome, and to do the things necessary to get effective programs. And, we talked about how important this program was. We've already seen response from state legislatures to outlaw eviction moratoriums unless they deem it as a real emergency, which, that crosses into how many people within our legislative structure are landlords. How many of these people are making these rules specifically to punish tenants, their constituents in the state, across the state? Because let me be clear, this isn't just a St. Louis City issue. You have issues with this in your Cape Girardeaus, in your Jacksons, in your Springfields, in your Kansas City, all over the state. And, this problem is not going to get better, and taking the issue off of the table is not going to really fix anything for anybody.
So as we wrap here, tenants are up against so much. There's a power dynamic between renters and landlords, which has always existed. Do you see an increased appetite for change? What has been the response to this investigative piece, Mike?
I think it's been a very strong response. I'm hearing from a lot of tenants. I've talked to people in St. Louis County about what they're going to do. There's a lot of simple fixes. We need more affordable housing, but in the meantime, we can do things like expand right to counsel. We could also, like in New York City, we have a requirement to have mediation before eviction is filed. We could even do something as simple as hiding people's records after 7 years, so they're not always hanging over them. But there's a tremendous amount we can do. The key thing is we spent a lot of money on this program, but all those results are unraveling because there was no thought to what happens after the pandemic.
Right. Mike and Kennard, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you. Yeah.
This episode was produced by Emily Woodbury.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.